Though the Christ myth theory, also known as the Jesus myth, is not original, it is very recent, historically speaking. The antecedents of the theory can be traced directly back to French Enlightenment thinkers Constantin François Volney and Charles François Dupuy in the 1790s. Proponents and authors cited in the Zeitgeist transcript have recently repopularized the theory. The questioning of Jesus' existence is not accepted by mainstream scholarship, as stated by Richard Burridge and Graham Gould in their book Jesus Now and Then, page 34. Michael Grant states on page 199 of his book Jesus and Historians' Review of the Gospels that the Jesus myth thesis fails to satisfy modern critical methodology and is rejected by all but a few scholars. Graham N. Stanton writes, "Today, nearly all historians, whether Christians or not, accept that Jesus existed and that the Gospels contain plenty of valuable evidence which has to be weighed and assessed critically. There is general agreement that, with the possible exception of Paul, we know far more about Jesus of Nazareth than about any 1st or 2nd century Jewish or pagan religious teacher." James Charlesworth sums it up. "No reputable scholar today questions that a Jew named Jesus, son of Joseph, lived. Most readily admit that we know a considerable amount about his actions and basic teachings." Jonathan Z. Smith, who contributed to the entry Dying and Rising Gods for the Encyclopedia of Religion, said, "The category of dying and rising gods, once a major topic of scholarly investigation, must now be understood to have been largely a misnomer based on imaginative reconstructions and exceedingly late or highly ambiguous texts. The category of dying and rising deities is exceedingly dubious. It has been based largely on Christian interest and tenuous evidence. As such, the category is of more interest to the history of scholarship than to the history of religions." Even liberal scholar Thomas Bosluper acknowledges, "Contemporary writers invariably use only secondary sources to verify such claims. The scholars whose judgment they accept rarely produced or quoted the primary sources. Yet Zeitgeist and its sources continue to propagate this theory in spite of all the evidence." In part 1 of the film Zeitgeist, nearly 200 sources are cited in the transcript. Yet many of these sources are used more than once, and none of them predate Christianity. For example, D.M. Murdoch, who also goes by the pen name Acharya S., is cited 29 times, and Gerald Massey is cited 30 times. The Bible is cited 22 times, almost always with erroneous conclusions. In fact, when the transcript for this film is examined in further detail, we see that less than 25% of these sources are original. Like the French Enlightenment thinkers, Sir James Frazer, cited 4 times in Zeitgeist, wrote The Golden Bough in 1890 when these mystery religions were still mysteries. It is from his work and others that Gerald Massey and Acharya S. get much of their information. However, Frazer's pioneering work has come under criticism by more recent scholars. When the newly accumulated archaeological and textual evidence is consulted, his ideas are no longer valid. Professor of History at Miami University, Dr. Edwin Yamauchi stated, "On the popular level, Sir James Frazer gathered a mass of parallels in his multi-volume work called The Golden Bough, which was published in 1906. He discussed Osiris of Egypt, Adonis of Syria, Attis of Asia Minor, and Tammuz of Mesopotamia, and concluded that there was a common rising and dying fertility god. Unfortunately, much of his work was based on a misreading of evidence." In 1970, John Allegro, another of Zeitgeist sources, wrote a book entitled The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. He proposes that the earliest Christians were actually a secret cult group that used hallucinogenic mushrooms and utilized the name Jesus as a code word to avoid letting outsiders know about their secret activities. Allegro was criticized immediately by almost every major historical scholar. The Times newspaper of London printed a letter signed by 15 scholars in the Semitic languages who dismissed his conclusions, stating that it was not based on any philological or other evidence that they can regard as scholarly. And what about this amulet of Dionysus as a crucified figure pictured and dated 500 BC in Zeitgeist? Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy, cited 7 times in the film, feature a picture of the amulet on the cover of their book, The Jesus Mysteries. The Zeitgeist claim that this amulet dates back to 500 BC is a lie. Actually, the amulet dates centuries after the 1st century AD, after the establishment of Christianity. One researcher, James Hannum, documented, although it features on the cover of the Jesus Mysteries, Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy are actually quite circumspect about the amulet in the text. I emailed them to ask in which book they had found it. Peter Gandy kindly replied that it was in the second edition of Guthrie's Orpheus and the Greek Religion, as well as R. Eisler's Orpheus the Fisher, first published in 1920. Oddly enough, it isn't in the appendix of either of these books. On my next visit to London, I looked both these books up at the Warburg Institute and found the note in Guthrie's work that the amulet was believed to be a fake. In subsequent email correspondence through an intermediary, Peter Gandy eventually came clean. I will quote in full. I have to admit that James Hannum is correct. Kern's comment is indeed in Guthrie's book. In sum, not only is the amulet shown in the film Zeitgeist and on the cover of the Jesus Mysteries a fake, but at least one author of the book knew it was a fake and kept quiet about it until now. This displays the dishonesty of Zeitgeist's Freak and Gandy, discrediting their researching abilities.
First, let me say something about Freak and Gandy's book. I do not recommend that book. I would prefer that no one ever read it. It's only marginally better than Percy Graves' work. Their research is on key parts, it's shoddy, and their source citations minimal, problematic. There's no way to know when they've gotten something right or wrong without redoing all their research, which makes their book useless. And that's the same complaint I had against Graves' book. To figure out what's in there that's even correct, you have to completely redo the whole work, and why even read the book if you're just going to do all the work yourself anyway.
Edward Carpenter is cited 8 times, but is hardly a qualified expert in our current inquiry, but was a socialist poet, philosopher, and early gay activist in the late 1800s. Thomas Doane is cited 19 times in Zeitgeist for his work Bible Myths and Parallels in Other Religions. One researcher responds, in chapter 28, page 282 of Doane's book, he asserts the things you mention about the parallels between Jesus and Krishna, or Krishna, as he spells it. He gives the appearance of documenting his assertions about Krishna being crucified and resurrected, for example, in extensive footnotes. But when you check out the footnotes, each one refers not to an original document for its basis, but to another chapter in the same book. In the case of the critical for Christian's assertion, the Resurrection, chapter 23, he then documents his statements about Krishna on page 215 in yet another footnote, this time again not to original documents of any kind, but to other scholars' books, Higgins' Anacalypsis and Asiatic Researches. I was able to find the Asiatic Researches and could only find one sentence there in which the author unknown simply referred, almost as a passing thought, to Krishna having died and returned to his heavenly seat. What kind of argument, much less evidence or proof, is that? Clearly, Doane is making wild and imaginative assertions here. Acharya S., author of The Christ Conspiracy, was the consultant for Zeitgeist. However, when one examines Acharya's bibliographical material, it is proven to be a ripoff from the material from earlier authors cited in the Zeitgeist transcript. Some of Acharya's most cited material comes from The World's 16 Crucified Saviors by Percy Graves. Any allegations of 16 other saviors who all resemble the same characteristics of Jesus is most likely based on this book. However, this book is an unreliable source. Even atheist Richard Carrier criticized, The World's 16 Crucified Saviors is unreliable, but no comprehensive critique exists. Most scholars immediately recognize many of his findings as unsupported and dismiss Graves as useless. After all, a scholar who rarely cites a source isn't useful to have as a reference even if he is right. In response to the lengthy and detailed refutations of Zeitgeist, Acharya S. has recently responded in a short 10-minute internet commercial for her books. We will analyze some of her ideas which have not been previously discussed in this film.
Why is the information in Zeitgeist Part 1 not widely known? In the first place, because of blasphemy and heresy laws, in the not-too-distant past, people could lose their jobs, friends, families, or even lives for merely questioning Christian dogma, which caused many people to remain silent on these issues.
Here is Acharya's first excuse for not having any evidence for her facts. Yet Acharya does not even present any evidence for her excuse of not having any evidence. The blasphemy and heresy laws to which she refers were imposed by the paganized Roman Catholic Church upon Christians who would not follow the Catholics' perverted religious practices, and the only information that was suppressed by those Catholics was the Bible, because it condemned their actions.
Also, much of this information can't be found in English, but it appears in other languages like Greek, Latin, German, French, Sanskrit, Hebrew, and Egyptian. Unless someone can work in other languages, he or she may never encounter these facts.
Now Acharya says the reason you can't validate the things she says is because she got them from other languages. And since we can't understand those languages, she is going to avoid referencing them altogether.
Many of these parallels between Christ and other gods and goddesses of the ancient world cannot be found in encyclopedia entries, and these seem to be where most of the debunkers are getting their information from.
Now she claims the facts cannot be found in encyclopedias and dictionary entries, yet she cites them. Notice the contradiction here. Acharya is citing the very sources which she claims cannot be used to validate her claims. By her own admission, she is not an expert.
And reading encyclopedia entries does not make an expert out of anyone.
Within 49 pages, she cites Wallace Budge 47 times, who is also cited 5 times in the Zeitgeist transcript. But the unreliability of Budge's work is even recognized by Acharya in the footnote of her companion's guide. She says, "I am aware of the debate concerning Dr. Budge's work, a controversy that some have suggested represents a form of rivalry not uncommon in the academic world or in the world at large. I personally have found nothing egregious about his discussion of the Egyptian religion in English, although I cannot vouch for everything in his hieroglyphic dictionaries, for instance, which are considered outdated in their system of transliterations, but which nevertheless appear to be sound overall."
Scholars in past eras were less specialized, and they did in fact make these connections within comparative religion, as my research demonstrates.
In reality, Acharya's research does not demonstrate or validate these connections. Even critical non-Christian scholars have rejected Acharya S.'s research, among whom is Dr. Bob Price, who said, "She is quick to state as bald fact what turns out to be, once one chases down her sources, either wild speculation or complex inference from a chain of complicated data open to many interpretations." One of the most intriguing claims made repeatedly in these books is that among the mythical predecessors of Jesus as a crucified God were the Buddha, the blue-skinned Krishna, and Dionysus. Is there any basis to these claims which Murdoch just drops like a ton of bricks? Again, she does not explain where they come from, much less why no available book on Buddha, Krishna, or Dionysus contains a crucifixion account. When Murdoch speaks of the Christ conspiracy, she means it. She really believes the people got together and cooked up early Christianity like a network sitcom.
Some of these parallels between Jesus and the other gods represent mysteries, such that these mysteries were not readily recorded.
If these mysteries were not written down, then there is no evidence. But somehow Acharya has made a case, despite the lack of evidence.
I incorporate many pre-Christian primary sources, as well as the works of scholars highly credentialed in the appropriate fields.
Actually, none of these sources predate Christianity.
Either primary sources or the works of highly credentialed scholars. For example, the parallels between Christ and the god Attis, who was brought up in Zeitgeist, are discussed by Dr. Andrew T. Fear, a professor of classics and ancient history at the University of Manchester in England.
Even Dr. A.T. Fear, Acharya's source, says that the resurrection of Attis did not appear until the beginning of the 4th century, inspired by Christianity, not vice versa. Attis, too, with his strong emphasis on resurrection, seems to be a latecomer to the cult. The stress on the Hilaria as celebrating the resurrection of Attis also appears to increase at the beginning of the 4th century A.D. It is important to remember that here we are discussing a period of centuries, not merely years. They do seem to have been provoked by a need to respond to the challenge of Christianity. Obviously, this is one of Acharya's strongest claims in support of her facts, since it made the cut into her 10-minute commercial. But her own source, Dr. Fear, embarrassingly admits that these similarities between Attis and Jesus were borrowed from Christianity and not the other way around, as she alleges.
The idea of the Indian god Krishna's mother being a virgin is not widely known and is therefore said to be wrong.
As demonstrated earlier, the Indian literature says just the opposite, that Devaki had 7 children before Krishna was born. The Bhagavad Gita is then shown on the screen, which is misleading because there is no record in the Bhagavad Gita or Mahabharata of a virgin birth for Devaki.
We should keep in mind that shouts for primary sources serve to remind us that Christians went on a rampage to censor and obliterate everything outside of their faith. In fact, these censors destroyed a huge amount of the type of evidence that we're discussing here.
Again, she makes excuses for not having any evidence or proof for her thesis, and warns us against those who would ask for such evidence. Without any evidence, the Jesus myth and astrotheology concepts are negligible.
While it is true that the wise men, magi, or kings are not numbered in the New Testament, their gifts are numbered as 3 at Matthew 2:11, gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
The only problem here with her interpretation is that the number of gifts does not determine how many magi there were. For example, in 2 Chronicles 21:3, there were also 3 gifts of silver, gold, and precious things presented to the sons of King Jehoshaphat. Yet there was not 3 contributors, but 1. There could have been numerous magi. The Bible does not specify how many magi there were because it is not an issue like Acharya S. makes it out to be. Since the December 25th birth date and 3 kings are so crucial to her thesis, she is going to try anything she can to make it fit. There is also no early Christian reference to the 3 stars in Orion's belt being known as the Magi, as she also alleges.